Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about a game that over the past few years has become one of my favorites, Kenshi. An RPG with management elements and a post-apocalyptic setting that stands out thanks to its harsh and inhospitable world. A place where, for most, survival is as much a victory as it is a curse. Where hunger and violence are almost a given and where both animal and people prey on the weak. In this video, we'll explain not only the events that led to the downfall of the ancient civilizations that once inhabited Kenshi, we're also going to analyze the horrors and dangers faced by those who live in this world in order to place it on the danger scale we use here on this channel. With that said, as usual, let's get in context. For those unfamiliar with Kenshi, it is a role-playing game set in a post-apocalyptic world, with aesthetics and themes heavily inspired not only by science fiction but also by feudal Japan. It is an open-world game where you control one or more characters who in their own way will try to survive and make a name for themselves amidst the crumbling remnants and literal skeletons of what was once an extremely advanced civilization. You can do anything from buying a house and turn it into a workshop to craft trading goods, to fight, train and gear up to become a bounty hunter, an anti-slaver or a criminal. This game does a fantastic job at building a world that feels truly alive, where things happen independently of the player and where entire cities or even nations can rise or fall. Kenshi's world also stands out for how brutal it can be. Death is permanent, losing one or more limbs is a common consequence of combat, and hunger and slavery are ever-present threats for almost everyone. Though in time and with proper training, you can build a team of elite fighters capable of destroying nations or even defending your own settlements. Settlements that will be attacked, besieged, and even started by the various factions that inhabit this world. Now, Kenshi is not only the title of the game, it is also the name of the natural satellite, the moon where its events unfold. It is a place ravaged by centuries of excessive industrial and mining activity, but more than anything by wars that happened hundreds or even thousands of years in the past. Conflicts that left behind a barren, contaminated land that is also suffering from an intense desertification process, where the little rain that falls can corrode the flesh, and where the caustic sand of the desert is capable of consuming bare feet. It is a relentlessly hostile place where clean water and fertile soil are scarce, where food is a luxury, and where for the vast majority of the population, safety means submitting to slavers, xenophobes or fanatics. And if scarcity, geography and climate weren't enough adversity, we also have to consider this world's inhabitants. Kenshi isn't just populated by massive deadly predators like gutters, schemers and huge land bats, among other creatures. It is also home to various intelligent species which we'll explore in more detail later, but these range from humans, who make up most of the population, to the enigmatic hivers, an anthropomorphic species of unknown origin with insectoid traits that organize themselves into hives ruled by a queen. We also have the Sheg, a humanoid species known for their warrior culture and the growth of horns and bone plates across their bodies. And finally there are the skeletons, the scarcest intelligent species in Kenshi. Ancient robots whose origins date back thousands of years to the very first civilization that settled this land, the First Empire, also referred to as the Ancients. Little is known about the empire created by the Ancients. It is likely that they weren't even native to Kenshi and probably just colonized this moon. The total length of their reign remains unknown, but we do know that they controlled the entirety of their territory probably for thousands of years, back to when sea levels were much higher and the continent was filled with rivers and dotted with multiple cities that, just like on Earth, traded with one another via ships, the remains of which can still be seen in certain regions. The civilization of the Ancients was highly advanced technologically. They had mastery over genetic engineering, artificial intelligence and robotics, and were capable of incredible technical feats. One of such examples is the remains of what appears to be a space elevator, but we can also find colossal orbital platforms like the Eyes, massive directed energy weapons aimed at Kenshi's surface, one of which remains active to this day in the region of Bench. These platforms may have been used for warfare, mining or even terraforming purposes, but the fact that at least one is still partially operational speaks volumes about the technological capabilities of this ancient civilization. The material culture of the First Empire suggests that it was structured into two castes: humans and skeletons who seemingly made up the majority of the population. And although there are conflicting reports on this matter, it is probable that humans were the leading group within this first empire. Not only are there in-game dialogues that point in this direction, but also, after the collapse of the Empire, the skeletons were not only unable to recover their prior level of technological advancement or rebuild civilization, they also stopped being produced altogether. This only makes sense if we assume that humans were their leaders and their creators. At some point in its history, the First Empire faced an external threat, likely a war with another civilization or maybe even with a feral species whose identity has been lost to time. However, we do know that in response to this conflict, the ancients created the behemoths, giant robots similar to skeletons but far more powerful who secured victory for the Empire. Peace, however, led humans to grow suspicious and fearful of what they had created. The behemoths were not mere war machines. Like skeletons, they possessed agency and intelligence, and when combined with their size and destructive power, they inspired fear and distrust among their creators. But they had one weakness: blind loyalty and obedience, something their creators would ultimately exploit to eliminate them. The behemoths were ordered to march into a narrow valley where they were swiftly buried under molten metal. The behemoth's grave is now known as obedience. Almost as a self-fulfilling prophecy, this cruel act, born out of fear, would prove to be the very thing that led to the collapse of the First Empire. The skeletons, witnessing what had been done to their kin, the behemoths, rebelled, maybe fearing they would be next. It is unclear what kind of weapons were used in the ensuing civil war, but records suggest that both conventional armaments and terraforming tools were deployed, alongside with biological weapons by the robots according to various documents. The destruction of the climate and ecosystems alongside with the spread of disease triggered a cataclysmic event in which humanity was nearly wiped out by its own creations. However, just as the skeleton's victory seemed inevitable, Stope, the last of the behemoths, emerged to intervene on behalf of humanity. It is unknown how he survived the massacre at obedience or what exactly he did to save his creators, but he brought an end to the war at the cost of his own existence. His remains still lie in Stope's gamble alongside the ruins of what might be missiles. Maybe it was the altruistic sacrifice of the last behemoth, or perhaps the realization that, driven by fear, they had repeated the same mistake their creators once made. Wherever the case, Stope's sacrifice for humanity filled the skeletons with a grief, sorrow, and shame that would haunt them forever. Hence phrases like "skeletons are always crying," as well as dialogues where they apologize to humans for no apparent reason. We also find documents that point to an existential crisis that led vast numbers of skeletons to take their own lives, drastically reducing their population. Madness took hold of some, while others simply erased their memories. What was left of the First Empire was a fragmented human population, likely very small, and that struggled to survive in a land ravaged by war. This is what came to be known as the Age of Chaos, and it was probably during this time that the northern cannibal tribes emerged, driven not only by famine but possibly also by the influence of toxins or pathogens that leaked out of the labs in this region that altered them both physiologically and psychologically. It is unknown how long the Age of Chaos lasted. It may have been centuries or even millennia. What we do know is that several cities managed to survive in isolation. Sea levels dropped by several meters, and the skeleton population was drastically reduced. But among the survivors, one emerged that was able to unite the remaining robots, a legendary skeleton known for his combat prowess who created the movement not only meant to preserve civilization, but also to protect the surviving humans. We're talking about Cat Lon, who would go on to found and lead the Second Empire alongside other notable skeletons such as Yang, General of the Hydraulic Knights, Hack 12, Commander of the Imperial Police, and Tenfist, right hand of the new Emperor. Unlike the First Empire, the second one was led by skeletons, initially with the role of protectors of humanity and with the goal of redeeming the errors and atrocities of the past, even if by then those errors and atrocities were all but forgotten by humanity or survive only in the form of distorted legends passed down during the Age of Chaos. This second empire expanded over a large portion of Kenshi, with its capital located in what would one day become the Ashlands in the southeast. However, it never truly managed to control the whole continent. To the north, the Hydraulic Knights waged several campaigns against the cannibals in an attempt to limit their raids, and although they never managed to fully wipe them out, to this day these tribes still react aggressively to the sight of a skeleton or an inedible one in their territory. Meanwhile, piracy was rampant at sea, which suggests that maritime trade was still a significant and active element during the Second Empire. Now, despite Cat Lon's original intentions to protect and guide humanity, as the human population grew and became harder to control, the empire gradually became more authoritarian. The first sign of this decline may have been the creation of the Enforcers, genetically modified humans designed to contribute to the defense of the empire, and while we don't know whether joining this caste of altered humans was voluntary, it does reflect the empire's willingness to adopt practices that are ethically questionable. Over time, the great war between humans and skeletons and Stove's sacrifice for humanity turned into a myth, and from this myth, a new religion was born, based on a highly distorted version of those events. This was the cult of Okram. In this religion, an ancient god named Kitrin sacrificed his existence to put an end to the disasters and calamities that plague humankind, even after being betrayed by those same humans. From Kitrin's sacrifice, two new gods were born. Okran, god of fire, light and renewal, as well as a representation of male humans, and Narko, goddess of darkness, evil, and a symbolic representation of non-humans, women to a lesser extent, and particularly skeletons, who according to this belief were always seeking the destruction of mankind. This placed the cult of Okram and its followers in direct opposition to the leadership of the Second Empire. As time passed, tensions between Okranites and the authorities only grew. And although we don't know who cast the first stone, Catlon, through the Imperial Police, eventually began persecuting the cultists, which in their eyes only confirmed what their belief had already told them, that the robots were their enemies. Violence begets violence, persecution led to radicalization, and with it, Catlon's once protective government gradually turned into an iron fist, and then into paranoid delusions. The Hydraulic Knights were used more and more against the civilian population. The label of pirate became so loosely applied that the authorities were killing more innocent people than the actual pirates. Child prisons were established, run by skeletons stripped of their moral processors, and to make matters worse, a severe famine began devastating the population. Catlon's paranoid regime soon started to be criticized from within its own ranks, and responded by literally and figuratively mutilating the dissenters, cutting off their heads and with them their free will. And thus the skeletons that once served under Catlon began to desert. Some would go on to found the small settlement of Black Desert City, while others, scattered into minor outposts, became solitary wanderers, or worse, descended into madness, giving rise to horrors like the Skin Bandits, who flay their victims in a grotesque attempt to become mockeries of human beings. The fall of the Second Empire was not a sudden collapse, but rather a slow decay more akin to rot than to ruin. And in fact, Catlon still sits on his throne. He remains in the ruins of the capital, now the Ashlands, alongside his commanders. Tinfist, Catlon's former right hand, however, would eventually become the leader of the anti-slaver faction, maybe still seeking redemption. Among all of this chaos, the Okronite cultists would seize control of the fertile heartlands of the continent found in the Holy Nation, a theocratic, highly racist, sexist, and xenophobic state where the entire population is subjugated under human males, and where anything related to skeletons is openly hunted down. This holy nation is ruled by the Holy Lord Phoenix, the human messenger of Okram on Earth, who is always reincarnating in the form of the fierce male born just after the death of the previous Phoenix. Now, the Empire didn't fall entirely. Many of the northern and southern coastal cities maintain a degree of cohesion, claiming the legacy of the Second Empire under a political entity known as the United Cities, a state more flexible socially than the Holy Nation, but where being poor is a crime punished with slavery. The United Cities are deeply tied to the Traders Guild and the slavers, who not only provide them with economic benefits but also transport essential goods such as water, food, and manpower, resources without which many of these cities could not survive. Despite having an actual emperor, Tengu, he is little more than a figurehead, a cruel, capricious man-child controlled by corrupt nobles and merchants who exploit the population through armies of samurai, which are also deployed in their constant wars against the Holy Nation. A third faction born from the remnants of the Second Empire was the Czech Kingdom, founded by the descendants of the Enforcers, those genetically modified humans who, rejected by the cultists, grouped together and over generations turned into a distinct population. Tough, strong, and belligerent, the Czech have a long history of continuous warfare against the Holy Nation, who view them as humans corrupted by narco. This legacy of war has not been kind to them, as their nature and culture forbid them to retreat even when it would be the wisest course of action. Also, their tendency towards conflict has led the Czech kingdom to political fragmentation and frequent infighting. However, all of this might be about to change with the rise of Esara, the Stone Golem, a leader that is as strong as she is pragmatic and that understands the existential threat faced by her people. Now, while the origin of most major factions in Kenshi can be traced back to the fall of the Second Empire, there is one group whose history remains shrouded in mystery, the Hivers. Even skeletons, Kenshi's most ancient and long-lived inhabitants, do not fully understand what Hivers are, often struggling to distinguish them from humans. This suggests that Hivers' appearance in history is relatively recent, probably just before or during the fall of the Second Empire. Some speculate that they may have come from another satellite or planet, or even from a distant continent beyond the seas, but in my opinion it is far more likely that Hivers were artificially created. The strongest evidence for this lies in the biomechanical nature of the queens who birth the other types of Hivers. These queens have metal-made dispenser units attached to their abdomens, which they use for reproduction. They are also classified as machines and cannot be healed through biological means. Another more tangential clue pointing to the synthetic origin of Hivers is the fact that the queen of the Southern Hive is guarded by a massive robot known simply as King. Additionally, some Hivers, particularly those from the Western Hive, exhibit superficial traits reminiscent of certain native species of Kenshi, like skin spiders. These creatures share a similar color pattern, tapering limbs like those of Hivers, and completely black eyes. Also, they have 3 fingers in some of their limbs, just as Hivers do, and the fact that skin spiders can be controlled by the Bug Master might be analog to the fact that Hivers can be controlled by their queens. With this in mind, one prominent theory suggests that Hivers were created under the orders of Cat Lon as a source of cheap, durable, and obedient labor easier to maintain than humans during the time of population decline and famine that plagued the Second Empire. We already know that this same empire experimented with genetic modifications, as seen in the case of the Czech. Hivers consume less food, can survive on rotting meat, and are immune to both acidic rain and soil. All of this could make them ideal replacement to human labor, and if this wasn't enough, they can be easily controlled by their queens, likely through pheromonal signals. However, when a Hiver remains separated from its queen for too long, this connection breaks, which often results in death. In rare cases, though, they may develop independence, and this has led to the increasing numbers of hive exiles that live, for example, in the United Cities, typically exploited and living under miserable conditions. When a queen dies, the remaining Hiver population devolves into a primitive and feral state, hunting down even humans to devour them, often while still alive. This is the origin of the Fog Men, who keep the city of Mongrel under constant siege. It is also possible that other life forms, such as the Fishmen, share a related origin with Hivers, perhaps as part of a similar effort to create labor forces, this time using genetic material from the giant crabs that inhabit Kenshi's coastal regions. Now, regarding the level of threat the world of Kenshi represents on the scale we use here on this channel, one might initially rate it as a 7, global disruption. Human civilization in Kenshi hasn't been fully destroyed and still holds the potential to reorganize and thrive. Factions such as the Holy Nation, the United Cities, and the Czech Kingdom all have the means to potentially conquer their neighbors and impose a degree of order capable of bringing stability and even, to some extent, prosperity. And, in my opinion, the Holy Nation appears to be in the strongest position. Not only it controls the most fertile territories, but also has a higher degree of internal cohesion and has recently secured a major victory in its two-front war against the northern branch of the United Cities, which in turn are ravaged by bandits, corruption, and above all famine, to the point where they even had to contend with uprisings. And there's also the fact that their territories are divided. The Czech Kingdom, on the other hand, is too busy fighting with other Czech factions and even other threats. However, there are several key factors that I believe could raise Kenshi's danger level to an 8: global destruction. Any semblance of a civilization that might rise would have to contend with exceptionally dangerous factions such as the Skin Spider Legions commanded by the Buckmaster, the Northern Cannibal Hordes, and most concerning of all, two particular threats: the carnivorous and aggressive Southern Hive and the Skin Bandits, who have already claimed hundreds of lives in the south. But without a doubt, the greatest threat to all of life on Kenshi is the instability of the moon's climate itself. Kenshi is not only home to intense volcanic activity in certain regions, but it is also being relentlessly bombarded by energy from the still active eye in Bench. This device continues to pour heat and energy onto Kenshi's surface, warming the air and creating powerful wind currents. These strong winds cause erosion, stripping the ground from its topsoil and thus from its capacity to retain nutrients and moisture and sustain life. A terrain without vegetation, in turn, becomes even more susceptible to erosion as it loses its protective plant covering, and this leads to a vicious cycle that ends in the formation of a desert. It is likely that this process was what created the Great Desert, and I actually think it is not random that this place is so close to the eye. This desertification process might be expanding into other regions as well. Water, vegetation, and arable land are already scarce across Kenshi, and it is entirely possible that over the span of centuries or even decades, the effects of the eye and the volcanoes will make these elements even scarcer, to the point of rendering life unsustainable not just for humans and other similar species, but even for plants and animals. Kenshi would become a dry, scorched corpse, an arid, lifeless wasteland where only the skeletons would remain, the final witnesses to a world they themselves helped destroy. A fitting punishment, almost poetic, and one that aligns perfectly with the themes and ideas that Kenshi, as a work, has presented to us from the very beginning. The only thing worse than this would be to not be subscribed to this channel and miss my next videos. I hope you enjoyed this one, and credit where credit's due. A shout out to the Reddit user Just Join, who took the time to gather most, if not all, of the lore related information from Kenshi in his posts, which served as the foundation of this video. Remember to feed the algorithm with a comment. That's all from me now, and I'll see you all in the next video.